Leah's life was a complex tapestry of triumphs and struggles. As a transgender woman living in a conservative southern town, she often found herself caught between two worlds. Her family, particularly her mother, Carol, struggled to accept her transition, while her faith journey had long since taken a back seat to the daily battles of living authentically. Despite the tension at home, Leah forged a path of independence. By day, she worked at a local nonprofit, advocating for marginalized voices. By night, she found solace in her close-knit group of friends who celebrated her for who she was. Yet beneath the surface, Leah wrestled with deeper questions about her identity, purpose, and faith, questions she avoided answering. A devout Christian in her youth, Leah's relationship with God had fractured under the weight of rejection from her church and community. If God made me, she often thought, why do I feel so wrong in everyone else's eyes? Her life took a sudden turn one fateful evening, leading to an extraordinary encounter that would shake her beliefs to their core. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. My name is Leah, and for as long as I can remember, I've been searching for peace. But it wasn't until I faced death that I began to understand where peace truly comes from. The day started like any other, busy and unremarkable. I had just finished a meeting at work and was driving home on the familiar winding road that cut through the outskirts of town. I'd driven that road 100 times, but something was different that evening. I was distracted, replaying an argument I'd had with my mother earlier in the day. "You're destroying yourself, Leah," she'd said with tears in her eyes. "Why can't you see how much it's hurting me? God didn't make you this way." Her words stung, but I'd learned to shrug off her disapproval, at least on the outside. As I navigated a sharp curve, a blinding light appeared in my peripheral vision. For a split second, I thought it was the sun reflecting off another car, but then I realized there was no car. A loud horn blared, and the next thing I knew, my car skidded out of control, tumbling down an embankment. Everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my car. I wasn't even sure I was alive. I stood in a vast expanse of light, brighter than anything I'd ever seen, yet it didn't hurt my eyes. A profound stillness enveloped me. I wasn't alone. A figure stepped forward, radiant and majestic, yet familiar. It was a man with piercing eyes and an overwhelming sense of love. "Leah," he said, his voice like the sound of rushing water, yet gentle. "I've been waiting for you." I was speechless. Somehow I knew this was Jesus. But he didn't look at me the way people had back on earth, with judgment or confusion. His gaze was full of love and understanding, and I couldn't help but break into tears. "I'm sorry," I whispered, unsure of why I felt compelled to apologize. My life, my choices, my identity, they all seemed to flood my mind in that moment. I expected him to reprimand me, to tell me how I'd failed, but he didn't. Instead, he showed me something. It wasn't like watching a movie. It was as though I was reliving the moments of my life through his eyes. I saw the times I'd felt rejected, the pain of hiding who I was, and the moments when I doubted his presence. But I also saw something else. Times I'd shown kindness, times I'd fought for others, and the love I carried in my heart, even when the world didn't love me back. "You've always been mine, Leah," he said, "but you've been searching for your worth in places that can't give it to you. Come with me, and I'll show you the truth." I wanted to go with him, but something held me back. A heavy feeling weighed on me, like unfinished business. "I can't," I said, tears streaming down my face. "There's so much I don't understand. I felt so lost." Jesus didn't argue. He simply placed a hand on my shoulder, and the light around me seemed to pulse with warmth. "You're not lost, Leah. You've just forgotten who you are and whose you are." Before I could ask him what he meant, the light began to fade. I felt myself being pulled backward, like being dragged through a tunnel. Panic set in. I didn't want to leave. When I woke up, I was lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines and the worried faces of my sister Emily and my friend Jordan. I had survived the crash, but I wasn't the same. Waking up in the hospital was surreal. My body ached all over, but it was nothing compared to the storm brewing inside me. The memory of what I'd experienced was so vivid, yet it felt like a dream too powerful to ignore. Emily leaned over me, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Thank God you're awake," she whispered, clutching my hand. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. My mind raced. Did I imagine it? Was it just a hallucination caused by the crash? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was real. As the days passed, the experience lingered like a shadow over everything I did. Jordan visited often, always cheerful and full of jokes, but even they noticed something was off. "You've been quiet lately," they said during one visit. "What's going on?" I hesitated. How could I explain this without sounding crazy? "I don't know," I finally admitted. "It's like something happened to me during the crash, something I can't explain." Jordan frowned. "Like what?" I took a deep breath and told them everything. The light, the figure, the overwhelming sense of love. "I think it was Jesus," I said, my voice trembling. Jordan's expression shifted from curiosity to discomfort. "Jesus?" they repeated. "Leah, you know how I feel about religion. That stuff it doesn't make sense to me." Their reaction stung more than I expected. Jordan had always been my rock, the one person who supported me unconditionally. But now I felt a gulf growing between us. It wasn't just Jordan. When I tried to share my experience with my mother, she reacted in a way I didn't anticipate. "Jesus spoke to you?" she asked, her tone a mix of skepticism and hope. "What did he say about your life?" I could tell what she was really asking. Did Jesus condemn me for being transgender? Did he tell me to change? "He didn't say anything about that," I replied softly. He loved me. He showed me things about my life, about how I've been looking for answers in all the wrong places." My mother looked at me, her eyes brimming with tears. "Leah, maybe this is his way of calling you back. Maybe he's trying to show you who you really are." Her words felt like a knife twisting in my chest. "I know who I am," I said, my voice shaking, "and he didn't make me feel like I had to change to be loved." "Why can't you see that?" Our conversation ended in silence, but the tension was undeniable. Even within myself, the questions swirled endlessly. If Jesus loved me as I was, then why had I spent so much of my life feeling rejected? By others, by the church, and sometimes by God himself. What did he mean when he said I'd forgotten who I was? Desperate for answers, I decided to reach out to Pastor Mark, a minister I'd known in my youth. I hadn't stepped foot in a church in years, but something drew me to him. When I arrived at his office, he greeted me warmly. "Leah," he said, "it's been a long time. What brings you here?" I hesitated, then told him everything. The crash, the vision, Jesus, the love I'd felt, and the confusion that followed. Pastor Mark listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "Leah, what you experienced sounds like a divine encounter," he said. "But God's messages often challenge us as much as they comfort us. Have you considered praying about what he showed you?" His suggestion caught me off guard. Prayer wasn't something I'd done in years, not since I felt abandoned by the faith I once held dear. But that night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer. "Jesus, if you're still there, help me understand." The days that followed my prayer felt like a blur, each one dragging on as I wrestled with the newfound truth in my heart. But one evening, something changed. It wasn't like the sudden flash of light I'd seen during my near-death experience, but it was just as powerful. I had been at home, sitting on the couch, staring at my phone, scrolling through messages from friends and family. But my thoughts kept drifting to that moment, the moment I stood in front of Jesus, bathed in his light. The overwhelming love I felt was still there, like a quiet whisper in my soul, but the confusion, it was growing louder. The world around me felt so distant from the experience I had. I was being pulled in two directions, the world I knew and the truth I was beginning to grasp. But what did that truth mean? Could Jesus really love me as I was? Was I meant to change, to live differently, in order to truly follow him? Was I wrong for being who I was? I got up, walked to the window, and looked out into the night. The streets were quiet, and the stars shimmered overhead. It was a moment of stillness, a moment when I could almost hear my own heartbeat. And then in the quiet, I felt it, a presence, right beside me. My breath caught in my throat as a voice, gentle yet undeniable, spoke to my heart. "Leah, remember what I showed you?" I turned around startled, my heart pounding in my chest. Was it a memory? A vision? I couldn't tell. All I knew was that the voice was real, and it was guiding me to something more. I closed my eyes and listened. The moment I did, a flood of images filled my mind. They weren't like the memories of my life that I'd seen in the light of the divine realm. these were different. They were moments of grace, moments where I had shown kindness, where I had been a reflection of Jesus' love to others. And then I saw it. The moment I'd been running from for so long. The moment I began to understand that my identity, my very existence, was not a mistake. I was not an accident, nor was I a person beyond redemption. But the real twist came when I saw something I hadn't expected, something far beyond the scope of my own understanding. I saw a vision of my mother, sitting in a pew at church, eyes closed in prayer. But she wasn't just praying for herself. She was praying for me, asking for God's guidance, asking for understanding. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My mother, who had rejected my transition so many times, was seeking God's help on my behalf. In that moment, I understood. Jesus hadn't just shown me his love for me, he was showing me the way to healing for everyone I loved. Not just for me, but for them too. In that vision, I saw a future where I wasn't alone in my journey, a future where I wasn't burdened by the weight of others' rejection, because through Jesus, healing would come. I didn't know how or when, but I knew this was a truth I had to cling to, and in that moment, something deep within me clicked. I wasn't meant to change who I was to be accepted by God. I was meant to grow in the truth of his love for me. Jesus didn't just love the idealized version of me, the one who conformed to the world's expectations. He loved the real, raw, and imperfect version of me. The Leah I had always been, the Leah I was struggling to accept. The words from Jesus echoed in my mind again. You've always been mine, and I've always been with you. I couldn't stop the tears from falling, nor could I stop the overwhelming wave of peace that flooded my heart. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen, not by society, not by my family, but by God. And he wasn't asking me to prove my worth. He was simply inviting me to trust him. But as much as the revelation filled me with peace, it also unsettled me. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something huge, something that would change everything. The next morning, I called Pastor Mark. I need to talk to you, I said. I think I finally understand what Jesus was trying to show me, but I don't know how to explain it. Pastor Mark listened carefully, and when I finished sharing, he paused. Leah, he said softly, this is a new beginning for you, but it's also a new beginning for everyone you've been holding this truth from. It's going to take time, but don't be afraid to share your story. Jesus has given you the strength to do this. As I hung up the phone, I realized something. The journey I had begun wasn't just mine alone. It was one that could potentially change the lives of those around me, family, friends, and even strangers. But with this new revelation came something else. The challenge of facing my family, my community, and my old beliefs. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I knew I couldn't go back. After my revelation, things didn't get easier. They got more complicated. For the first time, I felt like I was stepping into the light of a truth that could change everything, not just for me, but for the people around me. And that terrified me. I spent the following days in deep contemplation, trying to understand what this new truth meant for my life. I couldn't just go back to living in the way I had before, pretending to fit into the mold others had for me. But telling others about my experience, the things I had seen, the truth I had learned, was a different challenge entirely. The first person I told was Emily, my younger sister. I needed someone to talk to, someone I trusted, and Emily had always been the person who listened without judgment. But as I sat with her one evening in her apartment, I felt a knot in my stomach. I knew she wouldn't understand everything at once, but I hoped she would at least hear me out. Em, I need to tell you something, I started, my voice shaking. I had an experience. When I died, I met Jesus. Emily stared at me for a moment, her brows furrowed. What do you mean you met Jesus? I took a deep breath, then shared everything, the light, the presence, the overwhelming sense of love that surrounded me. I told her about how Jesus had shown me my life and how I wasn't wrong. I wasn't beyond redemption. I wasn't a mistake. When I finished, Emily was silent. It wasn't the stunned silence I feared. It was more like she was processing everything. She looked at me, her eyes soft with concern, but I could tell she was struggling to reconcile what I was saying with the faith she had always known. I don't know what to say, Leah, she said quietly. This is a lot, but if it's what you believe, then I'm not going to stop you. Just be careful. There are a lot of people who won't understand, and I don't want you to get hurt again." Her words struck a chord in me. I had already been hurt so much in my life, especially by the people who were supposed to love me most. But Emily wasn't rejecting me. She was just scared. Scared for me, scared of how others might react. I knew she didn't fully grasp what I was saying, but her support meant more to me than anything. The next person I reached out to was Pastor Mark. When we met, I told him I wasn't sure how to explain what I had learned. The concept of divine love and acceptance was too big, too radical for me to put into words, and I feared that if I said the wrong thing, I might alienate myself further from the people I cared about. "Leah, it's not about having all the answers right away," Pastor Mark said gently. "It's about living in that love you've encountered. You don't have to explain it perfectly. Just live it. Let your actions speak." But as comforting as his words were, I couldn't shake the fear that was building inside me. What if my family rejected me? What if they told me I was wrong, that I wasn't really hearing God? What if the people who had always claimed to love me couldn't accept the person I was becoming? A week later, I finally found the courage to speak to my mother. The conversation was hard, so much harder than I had anticipated. The words caught in my throat as I sat across from her, her tired eyes watching me. "I had an experience, Mom," I began, my voice trembling. "When I almost died, I saw Jesus, and he told me that he loved me just as I am." Her face twisted in disbelief, but there was something else there too. Hope. "Leah," she said softly, "I don't know what you're going through, but I've been praying for you. I've been asking God to show me how to love you through all this. If he's shown you that love, I can't deny that, but I also need to understand. I'm not sure how, but I want to try." It wasn't the total acceptance I had dreamed of, but it was a start. And in that moment, I realized that healing wasn't going to come all at once. It was going to be a process, not just for me, but for my family. However, my community at church didn't feel the same. When I shared my story with a few close friends, hoping for their understanding, I was met with cold silence. They didn't know how to reconcile the gospel with who I had become. Their looks of confusion soon turned into subtle judgments, and before long, I felt myself becoming an outsider once more. One evening, I attended a prayer meeting. The group had been kind to me in the past, but as I shared my testimony, I could feel the walls go up. "Leah," one of the leaders said gently, but with a firm tone, "we're concerned that you've misunderstood God's will. He doesn't want you to continue down this path. We love you, but we believe you need to turn away from this lifestyle." I felt my heart drop to my stomach. I hadn't expected full acceptance from everyone, but hearing those words, especially in a place I once considered a safe haven, was like a punch to the gut. But something inside me had changed. I no longer felt ashamed of who I was. I knew I was loved by Jesus and by those who were willing to love me through it. The rejection stung, but it no longer defined me. The road ahead wasn't going to be smooth, that much I knew. My revelation about Jesus's love for me didn't magically make everything in my life easier. In fact, it opened up a whole new set of challenges, ones I hadn't anticipated when I first felt his presence. The more I embraced this truth, the more I realized that the world around me was far less forgiving than I had hoped. It wasn't just my immediate family or friends I had to face. It was the people I had once seen as pillars of my life, the people who didn't understand, who might never understand. The first challenge was with my work. For years, I had been the proud manager of a small boutique in the city. I loved my job. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could escape from the pressures of the world and where I felt I had a place in society. But as I started speaking more openly about my experience and my faith, things began to shift. I wasn't trying to proselytize to anyone. I wasn't forcing my beliefs on others. But the changes in my life, how I saw the world, how I saw myself, became noticeable to those around me. I remember the first time my boss, Sarah, pulled me aside. Her office was small, tucked away in the corner of the store, and her eyes were sharp, always watching. When I walked in, she gave me a tight smile, though I could see the concern behind it. "Leah," she said, "I've noticed you've been acting a little different lately. You're not the same person who started here. Are you okay?" I nodded, but I could feel the pressure building in my chest. I had thought this conversation might come, but it still made my stomach churn. I'm fine, Sarah. Just going through some personal things. She leaned forward, her fingers tapping nervously on the desk. Personal things? Or is this something more? You've been talking about your faith a lot recently, and I know some people here don't really agree with that kind of thing. Some of our clients might not be too happy if they hear about it either. I swallowed hard. I'm not trying to push my beliefs on anyone, Sarah. I'm just trying to be honest about where I'm at in my life. She sighed, shaking her head. I know. But you have to understand that this is a business. If your personal beliefs start affecting how we operate or how our clients perceive us, that's a problem. We don't want any negative publicity. It was like a punch to the gut. I had always tried to keep my professional life and personal life separate, but now it seemed like my personal journey was becoming an obstacle. Sarah didn't outright say it, but I could feel the unspoken message. If I didn't tone down my faith, it might cost me my job. The same job that had once been my safe space, the place where I felt accepted, now felt foreign. I left that conversation in a daze. The truth I had encountered was reshaping everything in my life, and I wasn't sure how much of it I could hold on to. Was it worth risking my career to stand firm in my beliefs? Could I reconcile my growing faith with the demands of the world around me? The challenge was becoming all too clear. Jesus was asking me to follow him, but in doing so, I might lose everything I had worked so hard to build. At home, things weren't much easier. My mother had made an effort to be more open to me, but I could see the strain it put on her. I knew she was struggling with the idea of me as a trans woman, especially now that I was speaking so openly about Jesus. She didn't know how to reconcile the person I was with the teachings she had held dear her whole life. Her internal conflict was clear, and though she tried to hide it, I could see the toll it was taking on her. One evening, as we sat together at the kitchen table, my mom finally spoke up. Leah, I know you're going through something important right now, and I want to be supportive, but I'm still struggling to understand how this all fits with who you are. How do I balance what I've been taught with what you're telling me? I felt my heart ache. I knew this wasn't just about me. It was about her own faith, her own worldview being shaken to its core. Mom, I know it's hard, but I've never felt more certain in my life that Jesus loves me just as I am. I'm not asking you to change everything you believe, but just to see me through his eyes, to understand that this love, his love, isn't about fitting into any mold. It's about accepting who we are, flaws and all. She nodded slowly, but there was still hesitation in her eyes. I don't know if I can do that, Leah. I just don't know. That was a difficult pill to swallow. I had hoped that our relationship would heal quickly, that the love and understanding I had experienced in my encounter with Jesus would somehow make things easier between us. But it was clear that both of us had a long road ahead. Outside my family, I faced other struggles too, my church community. The more I shared my experience, the more I felt the weight of their skepticism. Pastor Mark had been supportive, but there were others who couldn't reconcile the Jesus they knew with the version of me that I was becoming. I was beginning to feel isolated in ways I hadn't expected. People who once saw me as a friend now whispered behind my back. The church, which had been my place of comfort, now felt like a place where I was walking in with a target on my back. The more I grew in my faith, the more I realized that my transformation wasn't just about me. It was about everything I knew being turned upside down, and the challenge of learning to stand firm in a love that sometimes felt far from the people around me. But through it all, one truth remained clear. I couldn't let go of the love I had found. Even if it cost me everything, Jesus was worth it. As time passed, the weight of my transformation began to settle in deeper, and with it, the complexity of my emotions. I thought I understood the challenges I was about to face when I embraced the love Jesus had shown me, but the reality was more difficult than I had imagined. The spiritual clarity I had found came with an emotional toll, and it wasn't just about the people around me anymore. It was about me, how I saw myself, how I fit into a world that didn't always seem to understand or accept me. The first night I truly felt the weight of isolation was after a difficult conversation with a longtime friend, Claire. Claire had been a part of my life for years. She was one of the first people I had come out to as a trans woman, and we had been through a lot together. We shared everything, our hopes, our fears, our dreams. But as I began speaking more openly about Jesus, I noticed a subtle shift in our friendship. She didn't reject me outright, but she started pulling away, the conversations becoming more surface level. The lighthearted banter we used to share faded into uncomfortable silence. One evening, we were sitting at our favorite coffee shop, and I decided to address it. I didn't want to lose her, but I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine. "Claire," I began softly, "I know things have been different between us lately, and I need to know where you stand." She looked at me, her lips tight, but I could see the sadness in her eyes. "Leah, I care about you. I really do. But all of this with your faith, it's hard for me to understand. I don't know if I can accept it." My heart ached. "I'm not asking you to agree with everything I believe. I'm just asking you to accept me for who I am now. I'm still the same person, but I've changed, and I need you to see that." She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's not that simple. I don't know how to reconcile the person you were with the person you are now. You found something that I can't quite get, and I don't know if I'm willing to try." The words cut deeper than I expected. It wasn't just the rejection, it was the feeling that I was being torn between the person I had been and the person I was becoming. Claire's love for me was conditional on my staying the same, and I wasn't the same anymore. That night I lay in bed replaying the conversation in my head. The internal conflict was suffocating. I missed the old version of myself, the person who hadn't been burdened by this heavy spiritual awakening, the person who had been carefree and unburdened by the need for constant introspection. But that person didn't exist anymore. I had seen something, experienced something so powerful that I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. I couldn't just go back to being who I was before. The fear of losing everyone I loved was something I grappled with daily. It wasn't just about Claire. It was about all the people in my life, the ones who had known me in a different light. It was about the old friends who didn't understand why I couldn't just leave the past behind and live in peace. It was about my family, who still struggled to accept the depth of my transformation, and the church, who couldn't wrap their heads around a trans person finding Jesus. Yet despite all of this, I found myself increasingly at peace with my decisions. Every morning I woke up feeling a sense of clarity that I hadn't known before. The words I had heard from Jesus, the unconditional love, the grace, the deep sense of belonging, became a steady source of strength. I began to realize that while the relationships I held dear were vital, they couldn't be the sole foundation of my identity. I was learning that my true identity was in Christ, and no matter how hard the journey, I couldn't turn away from that truth. But that didn't make the internal struggle any easier. Every time I tried to reach out to someone I cared about, whether it was Emily, Claire, or even my mom, I couldn't shake the sense of fear that accompanied it. Was I losing them? Would I be alone in this newfound faith? The emotional dilemmas I faced weren't just external, they were deeply internal. I was constantly torn between the desire to keep the peace and the need to live authentically. And while I knew the path ahead was one of immense personal growth, it was clear that the journey would never be simple. There would be sacrifices, there would be moments of deep loneliness. But through it all, I had this unwavering sense of purpose, an undeniable calling that had been planted in my heart the moment I met Jesus. As the days went by, the world around me seemed to close in tighter. Every decision I made, every conversation I had, felt charged with the weight of what I was becoming and the sacrifices that were required to live in this new truth. At first, the tension was subtle. Small comments from people I loved, odd glances, the occasional joke at my expense. But as time passed, the cracks in my relationships began to widen. I was torn between holding on to the people I had known for so long and embracing the new life that was unfolding before me. One evening, I had a conversation that shifted everything. It wasn't just a casual exchange. It was a moment that confirmed the spiritual depth of my transformation and also the danger of the road I was walking. I was sitting in the back of a quiet cafe sipping a lukewarm cup of tea when a familiar face entered. It was Pastor Mark, the one person in my church community who had seemed to accept me without hesitation. He had listened to my story with open arms, never once questioning my place in God's kingdom. But when he sat down across from me, I noticed a hesitance in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "Leah, I've been thinking a lot about you," he began, his voice cautious. "I've been hearing things from some of the people in the congregation. There's been talk, whispers really, that you're going too far with this whole new life thing. That maybe you're leaning too heavily into the idea that your transformation is about faith, that this isn't just a personal choice, but a calling." I swallowed, my heart racing. "Pastor, I don't know how to explain it any other way. This isn't just a phase for me. This is real. I found something that has completely changed my life. Jesus isn't just a part of my life now. He's the center. I can't deny that anymore." Pastor Mark looked down, clearly struggling. "I know, Leah, and I believe you. But the question is, are we all ready to fully accept this? Are we willing to allow your journey to change what we've known about faith, about what it means to truly follow Christ?" I felt a chill run through me. "What do you mean?" "The church, our community, they're not all as open-minded as I am. Some are questioning whether we should be embracing a person who has gone through such a radical transformation, someone who is still walking in the shadow of their past life. They're afraid this might be a distraction, something that will pull us away from the core message of salvation." His words struck like a blow. For the first time, I realized that my faith, my journey, wasn't just a personal transformation. It was challenging the very fabric of the community I thought would always support me. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about how others were seeing me and the ripple effects of my faith on the people around me. There were some in my life, both in the church and outside it, who didn't believe my transformation was real. And they weren't going to let me move forward without making sure I knew just how much they disagreed. I wanted to argue, to tell Pastor Mark that they were wrong, that I wasn't some project or oddity to be scrutinized. But the truth hit me. Deep down, I understood. They were afraid of the change I was experiencing because it didn't fit their expectations of what a Christian should look like. It was easier for them to dismiss me as someone who didn't truly understand faith than to grapple with the implications of what my life meant for theirs. As I left the cafe, my mind raced. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't backtrack. I couldn't go back to who I was before. But I also didn't want to cause division. I had spent so many years longing for acceptance from the world, and now I was faced with the brutal reality that my new faith was pushing me further into isolation. That night, I turned to my Bible for comfort, something I hadn't done as much in recent weeks. I had been distracted, unsure of where I fit into the world, but I knew that the answers I needed would be there. I opened the pages, searching for clarity, and as I read, something shifted. I came across a verse in Matthew, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." I closed my eyes, the words sinking deep into my heart. I had spent my life fighting to fit in, but now this passage felt like it was speaking directly to me. The cost of following Jesus was high, but the reward, eternal peace and the love of God, was greater than anything I had ever imagined. The realization settled within me. I wasn't just facing the tension of my past and present. I was being called to something higher. To walk with Jesus wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be about keeping the peace, about making others comfortable. It was about truth. And truth was often uncomfortable. The following days were filled with tension. I received messages from friends who didn't understand, from church members who were doubtful, and even from family who didn't know how to reconcile their love for me with their belief in what I should be. But I held firm to the knowledge that this journey was mine, and mine alone, to walk. And the more I leaned into that truth, the more it became clear that Jesus was right there with me, in every moment of doubt, every tear, every struggle. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore: the whispers, the rumors, the comments. There was something else in the air, something deeper and more threatening. There were forces at work, spiritual forces that seemed to be pushing against me, trying to pull me back to my old life. The more I embraced Jesus, the more it seemed like something or someone was trying to stop me from moving forward. I didn't know what to make of it, but one thing was certain: I wasn't about to turn back. As my journey progressed, it wasn't just my own beliefs that were shifting. The ripple effect of my transformation began to touch everyone around me, whether they realized it or not. It wasn't always obvious at first, but as I became more vocal about my faith, the dynamics of my relationships shifted in ways I wasn't prepared for. Emily, my sister, was the first to notice. We had always been close, but she had never fully understood the depth of my struggles, both with my identity and my faith. We'd had some difficult conversations in the past about my transition, but I had never really explained the spiritual awakening I was experiencing. At first, she seemed unaffected, but as I shared more about my new life, about the love I was discovering in Jesus, her reactions grew more complex. One evening, we were sitting on the porch watching the sunset when she finally asked, "Leah, do you really believe this? I mean, all of it? That Jesus is real? That he saved you?" I was surprised by the question. Emily had always been skeptical of organized religion, and the idea of me embracing Christianity was something she had never quite understood. "Yes, Emily, I do," I replied, my voice steady but full of emotion. "It's not just a belief, it's my truth now. It's changed me in ways I can't explain. It's not about what I was or who I was. It's about what I've become. Jesus has shown me love that I didn't know was possible. I'm not perfect, but I am forgiven." She looked at me, her face a mixture of confusion and concern. "But this is so different from what we were taught growing up. We didn't go to church, we didn't pray, and now you're telling me that this Jesus, this faith, is everything to you? I don't know how to wrap my mind around it." I could hear the hurt in her voice, the sense of loss. "I know it's hard to understand. It doesn't fit into what we knew or what we were taught. But it's not about religion. It's about a relationship. I found something real, Emily, and I want to share that with you. I want you to see what I see." Emily stayed silent for a while, as if weighing my words. I could tell she was struggling. "I'm not sure I can accept this, Leah. I just can't. You've changed so much, and I don't know where I fit into all of this anymore." Her words stung, but they were also a mirror to my own feelings. The more I embraced my faith, the more I felt like I was losing parts of my past that I had held dear. I had always counted on Emily being there for me, supporting me, but now it felt like a gap was forming between us. She wasn't the only one I was losing touch with. Claire had drifted even further. The friendship we once had was becoming more and more distant. It wasn't just that she didn't understand my faith. She actively resisted it. At times, I felt like I was talking to a stranger when we spoke. She couldn't bring herself to accept the person I had become, and that was creating a rift between us that I wasn't sure could be mended. But then something unexpected happened. One Sunday morning, a message from Claire popped up on my phone. I hadn't heard from her in weeks. The message was simple. "Can we talk? I need to ask you something." I didn't know what to expect, but I agreed to meet her at our usual spot in the park. When I arrived, she was sitting on the bench, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She looked up when she saw me and gestured for me to sit down. For a few moments, neither of us said anything. The silence was thick with unspoken words. Finally, she spoke. "Leah, I've been thinking a lot about what you've been saying. I've been thinking about how much I've distanced myself from you, and I realize I've been unfair." I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing. Unfair? Yeah, I've been so wrapped up in what I thought was right, in my own beliefs, that I didn't give you the chance to explain yours. You've gone through so much, and I've just judged you for it. I'm sorry. I don't know where we go from here, but I don't want to lose you. Her words took me by surprise. I had spent so long feeling like she would never accept me, never understand the change I had undergone. But here she was, acknowledging the distance and asking for a chance to rebuild. "I've missed you, Claire," I said quietly, "but I've been so afraid that I'd lose you forever, that I'd be too different for you to accept. I never wanted that." We sat there in silence for a while, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The tension between us was still there, but it was softer now, less sharp. We both knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but there was a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. As I walked away from our conversation, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from everything being resolved, but the kind that came from knowing that I was standing in truth. I had come to realize that while my relationships were changing, and some were being tested to their limits, I was learning to trust God more deeply. I was learning that the love I had found in Him was enough, even when the people I loved didn't fully understand. But there was still much to face. The more I grew in my faith, the more I realized that there was a long journey ahead, one filled with both joy and hardship. But I also knew that the God who had brought me this far would not abandon me now. The tension between my past and present had reached a boiling point, and now it seemed that everything was coming to a head. It wasn't just my personal struggles anymore. It was becoming clear that my journey was stirring up much more than I had anticipated. As I grew deeper into my faith, I realized that the changes in me weren't just causing confusion and tension in my relationships. They were challenging the very foundation of who I had been, and in many ways, who I still was. One afternoon, I had an encounter that would force me to make a decision that I had been avoiding. It came in the form of a confrontation with my mother, who had been distant ever since I'd started speaking about my spiritual awakening. Our relationship had always been complicated, but this new chapter in my life seemed to be pushing her further away. I walked into the living room that day to find her sitting on the couch, her arms crossed tightly as she stared at the television. The air in the room felt heavy, like something was about to shift. I sat down next to her, trying to ease the tension, but she didn't look at me. "Leah," she began, her voice cold. "I've been thinking a lot about everything you've been saying about Jesus, about your transformation, and I just don't understand it. You're my daughter, and I love you, but what you're telling me about your new life, it doesn't make sense." My heart sank. I had known this conversation was coming, but I wasn't prepared for the sting of her words. "Mom, I know it's hard, but this is the truth I've found. I'm not the person I was before. This journey has changed me, changed the way I see everything. I've found purpose in Jesus, and it's not something I can walk away from." She looked at me now, her eyes filled with frustration and confusion. "But why? Why Jesus? Why now? You were fine before, Leah. You were happy living your life. Why this sudden change?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle in my chest. "It's not sudden. This has been building for a long time. It's not about being fine. It's about what's real, about understanding what love really means. Jesus showed me something that I can't deny, Mom. He showed me a life of forgiveness, grace, and unconditional love." My mother shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You're throwing everything away. You're throwing away the life we built, the values I've taught you. What will people think? What will your friends say? This isn't just about you, Leah. This affects all of us." The weight of her words hit harder than I expected. It wasn't just my life that had changed. It was our life, my family's life. I had always feared that my transformation would be something that separated me from the people I loved, but I hadn't realized how deep the chasm would feel. The walls that had begun to form around me now felt insurmountable. "I'm not throwing everything away, Mom," I said softly, my voice breaking. "I'm finding something that's true, and I want to share it with you. I want to bring you into this too." But she couldn't hear me. The walls were up, and she was retreating behind them, unable to accept the person I had become. "Leah, I don't know how to support you anymore. I don't know how to deal with this. I don't know how to reconcile this new you with the daughter I raised." I was stunned by her words. It felt like a knife to the heart. The reality that I was losing my mother, not just to my faith, but to my new identity, hit me hard. I had always thought that family love would overcome everything. But now, the love I thought would always be there seemed to be slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. "I'm still your daughter, Mom. I'm still the same person I was. I still love you. But I've found a new path. I can't go back." Her face contorted with a mixture of anger and grief. "Then, you've chosen your path. I hope it brings you the peace you think it will, Leah. But you're on your own now." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I felt as if the ground beneath me had shifted, and I was falling into a void. I didn't want to let go of the woman who had raised me, the mother who had been my support for so many years. But in this moment, I realized that my journey had become too important to turn back from. I could no longer pretend that everything was fine when I knew deep down that the truth was reshaping me in ways I couldn't ignore. As I left the house that day, a deep ache settled in my chest. My heart was torn between the love I had for my mother and the undeniable truth that I was being called to something higher, something greater than the life I had known. I wanted to make peace. I wanted to believe that reconciliation was possible. But I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The conflict between my old life and my new faith was now impossible to ignore. And yet, even as the pain of rejection and loss washed over me, there was something else stirring in my heart, a quiet assurance that I wasn't truly alone. God had been with me every step of the way, guiding me through the darkness and into His light. He had shown me the love I had always longed for, and while the road would be difficult, I knew that I was never without hope. The days that followed the confrontation with my mother were filled with an overwhelming sense of loss. It wasn't just the fracture in our relationship that hurt. It was the gnawing feeling that I was being pulled in two opposite directions. On one side, there was the pull of my past, the life I had known, the love I had received, and the comfort of familiarity. On the other side, there was the undeniable call of God, the truth that had awakened my soul and was leading me toward a new path. The conflict between these two worlds had never been so sharp, and I felt like I was standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure of which direction to take. The guilt I felt was suffocating. Was I really choosing this new life over my family, over my mother's love? I couldn't help but wonder if I was abandoning everything that had shaped me for something I didn't fully understand. Could I really walk away from the person I had been, the daughter they had raised, and embrace the new identity God was revealing to me? And if I did, what would become of my relationships with everyone I loved? It wasn't just my mother who had pulled away. Even Emily, my sister, had started to distance herself. Though she had shown more willingness to listen, her heart seemed heavy with doubt, torn between her love for me and the teachings she had known her entire life. I saw the sadness in her eyes when we talked, the way she hesitated when I shared anything about my faith. She wasn't rejecting me outright, but it was clear that she didn't understand the depth of the change in me, and part of her was afraid of it. One evening, after another tense conversation with Emily, I found myself alone in my room, struggling with the weight of my decisions. I sat on my bed, staring at the Bible in my hands, the words on the pages swirling in my mind. How could I continue down this path if it meant losing everything I once held dear? How could I bear the pain of alienating the people I loved? That's when I remembered the quiet, still voice I had heard when I was at my lowest, the voice that had comforted me in my darkest hours and filled me with hope. God had never promised that following Him would be easy, but He had promised that He would be with me every step of the way. I couldn't ignore the transformation He had brought in me, the peace and clarity that had replaced the chaos and confusion of my former life. I wasn't who I used to be, and I couldn't keep pretending that I was. With a deep breath, I closed my eyes and prayed. God, help me. I don't know what to do. I'm torn between my love for my family and the truth You've shown me. I don't want to lose them, but I know I can't deny what I've found in You. Please, guide me. Show me what I need to do. The answer didn't come immediately, but there was a peace that washed over me, a sense of clarity that I hadn't felt before. The road ahead would be difficult, but I knew that I couldn't keep walking in two worlds. I had to fully embrace the life God was calling me to, even if it meant facing rejection, even if it meant standing alone at times. I couldn't live a half life anymore, trying to please everyone and hold on to a past that was no longer mine. The next day, I reached out to Emily and told her that I needed to talk. We met at the park again, and this time, there was no avoiding the truth. As we sat down, I took a deep breath and began to speak from my heart. Emily, I love you. I know that this isn't easy, and I know it's hard to understand everything that's happening. But I need you to know that my faith in Jesus is not just something I'm doing because it's the right thing or because it makes me feel better. It's who I am now. It's not just a belief, it's the foundation of my life. I want you to know that I'll always love you, but I can't deny this truth. She looked at me with tears in her eyes, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of the conversation was too much to bear, and I knew this wasn't the resolution I had hoped for. But as I spoke, I felt a sense of strength in my conviction. I was no longer questioning my path. I was standing firm in the truth I had found. And no matter what came next, I knew that God was with me. "I don't understand it, Leah," Emily said, her voice shaky. "But I don't want to lose you either. I'm not ready to let go, but I don't know where we go from here." I reached out and squeezed her hand, grateful for her willingness to listen. "I'm not going anywhere, Emily. I'm still your sister. I always will be." But deep down, I knew this was a turning point. The conversations ahead, the choices I would have to make, would be even harder. My journey was no longer just about me finding faith. It was about navigating the tension between the truth I had found and the relationships I had always cherished. The stakes had never been higher, and I could only move forward by trusting that God would continue to lead me, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. As the days passed, the weight of the choices I had made became more evident, and the struggle within me intensified. The distance between me and my family seemed to grow with each passing day. My mother's rejection still echoed in my heart, and though Emily's willingness to listen remained, the silence between us was growing louder. The emotional strain felt like a constant pressure on my chest. I found myself caught in a cycle of doubt, where each decision felt like it was pushing me further away from the people I loved. The world I had known, the one shaped by my family, my friends, my past, felt like it was slipping through my fingers. And yet, there was a pull that was impossible to ignore. The more I prayed, the more I sought God, the more I felt a sense of peace that transcended everything else. But the internal battle raged on. In those quiet moments of doubt, I began to question if I had truly made the right choice. Was this truly the life God was calling me to? Was I willing to lose everything to follow Him? The fear of loneliness, of being misunderstood, of completely severing ties with my past was overwhelming. I had spent so many years running from parts of myself, from a past that was full of shame, and now I was walking headfirst into a future that promised pain, rejection, and the loss of everything I had ever known. But as I struggled, I couldn't shake the memory of the vision I had during my near-death experience, the feeling of being held by love so pure and so overwhelming that nothing else mattered. In that moment, when I was face to face with Jesus, I knew with every fiber of my being that His love was enough. It was greater than anything I had experienced, greater than anything I had feared. It was a love that healed, that restored, and that called me to something beyond myself. It was a love that was not confined to the walls of the world I had built, but extended far beyond them, into the unknown, into the vastness of God's grace. And in the depths of my turmoil, that truth became my anchor. I knew I had to make a choice, one that would define not only my future, but the trajectory of my spiritual journey. It wasn't just about living out my faith for myself anymore. It was about embracing the cost of following Jesus, no matter the sacrifice. It was about embracing my transformation, even if it meant standing apart from everything I had known. I couldn't keep living in the shadows, torn between two worlds. My heart ached for my family, for their understanding, but I knew that my allegiance was no longer to my past. It was to Christ. The night before my next confrontation with my mother, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace, something I hadn't felt in weeks. It was as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, and I was finally able to breathe. I prayed deeply, asking for clarity and strength to face whatever would come next. In that moment, I knew that I was ready. Ready to speak the truth, even if it broke my heart. Ready to stand firm in my faith, even if it meant continuing without the support of those I loved. The following morning, I called my mother again. The conversation that awaited us was inevitable. I had to speak my truth, and I had to do it with love, even if she couldn't understand it yet. But I also knew that I couldn't keep holding on to the hope that everything would return to how it once was. I couldn't keep living in fear of rejection. My path was clear. When I saw her face again, I took a deep breath and said the words I had been holding back for so long. "Mom, I love you. I always will. But I can't turn back. I've chosen this path because I believe it's what God has called me to. I don't know what that means for our relationship, but I know that I can't deny the truth I've found. Her face softened for a moment, but the hurt was still visible in her eyes. The silence that followed felt heavy, so thick that I could almost touch it. I didn't know what would come next, but I was prepared to face it. The tension was unbearable. But at that moment, I realized that I had already crossed a threshold. I had already made the choice to follow Jesus fully. Whether my family came with me or not, I knew that I was no longer walking alone. The road ahead was uncertain, but my heart was at peace, grounded in the love of Christ. And that love, I knew, would guide me through the storm that lay ahead. The days following that conversation with my mother felt surreal, as if I had crossed an invisible line from which there was no return. The tension between us remained thick, unspoken, yet deeply felt. But strangely, I wasn't as broken as I expected to be. I was sad, yes, grieving the loss of something I once thought would always be there. Yet there was a strange peace that enveloped me. I knew that I had made the right choice, even if the cost seemed too high at times. Then came the moment I had been dreading, a final confrontation with my mother. She called me one afternoon, her voice quieter than usual. I could hear the hesitancy, the uncertainty, but also a deep longing for understanding. It was as if, after all the pain, she was finally ready to hear what I had to say. I went to meet her, my heart racing as I prayed for strength. When we sat down together, there was no anger or bitterness in her eyes, only sadness, a profound sadness that pierced my soul. "I don't understand any of this, Leah," she began, her voice trembling. "But I can't stand to see you like this, to see you torn between who you were and who you are now. You've changed, and I don't know how to help you. All I want is for you to be happy. But is this really happiness? Is this really the life you want?" Her words hit me like a storm, but I didn't shy away from them. I understood the pain in her voice. It mirrored my own. The very act of choosing faith had created this chasm between us, and I knew there was no way to bridge it entirely. But what I also knew was that I couldn't deny what had been awakened in me, what God had done in my heart. "I can't explain everything, Mom," I said, my voice steady despite the storm in my chest. "But I know this. Jesus has healed me. He's restored me in ways I never thought were possible. He has given me a new life, and I can't turn away from that. I know it's hard, but I can't deny what I've experienced." She looked at me with eyes filled with both sorrow and love, and for the first time, I saw the depth of her struggle. It wasn't just my transformation she was grieving. It was the loss of the daughter she thought she knew, the girl who had walked a path so different from the one I was now on. She wasn't rejecting me. She was mourning the change, the uncertainty, and the gap that was widening between us. But in that moment, I realized something profound. I had done the one thing I was most afraid to do. I had fully embraced my new life in Christ. I had chosen the truth that I believed in, and even though the pain of losing my old life was real, it no longer controlled me. I could no longer live for the approval of others, for the comfort of familiarity. God had called me to something more, something beyond my own understanding. And though the road ahead was still unclear, I knew it was the right one. Tears filled my eyes, not from sadness, but from a deep sense of peace. I reached out and took my mother's hand. "I love you, Mom. I always will," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "But I can't go back. Not now. I've found something more. And I want you to know that no matter what, I will always be here for you." For the first time, my mother didn't pull away. She didn't understand, but she accepted. Her tears fell softly, not in anger, but in a quiet, uncertain hope. There was no dramatic resolution, no magical reconciliation in that moment. But there was a shift, a small yet significant change. In the weeks that followed, my mother and I began to rebuild. Slowly and with hesitation, we learned to navigate this new version of our relationship. There were still moments of tension, but they were no longer filled with the sharp edges of rejection. Instead, there was a willingness to listen, a softness that had been absent before. And though we still didn't see eye to eye on everything, I realized that we were both growing, both finding healing in different ways. As for me, my spiritual journey continued to evolve. The choice to follow Jesus was no longer just an abstract belief. It was a living, breathing part of me. The struggle, the pain, and the rejection had shaped me, but they no longer defined me. I had embraced my identity in Christ, and in doing so, I had found a deeper sense of peace, purpose, and strength. I knew the road ahead would continue to be challenging, and I wasn't sure where it would lead. But I also knew that I was not alone. Jesus was with me every step of the way, and that, above all, was the truth that carried me forward. Reflecting on my journey, I realized that everything I had gone through, every tear, every moment of doubt, every rejection, had brought me to a place of true understanding. I had walked through fire, faced my deepest fears, and lost parts of myself that I thought were unchangeable. But in the process, I had found something infinitely more precious, a deep, unshakable faith that had transformed me in ways I could never have imagined. What I've learned through this journey is that faith is not just a set of beliefs. It's a living, breathing relationship with God that requires everything we are. It challenges us to let go of who we were, to embrace the person God has called us to be, even when the cost feels too high. But in the end, there is a peace and joy that comes from knowing you are walking the path that God has set before you. I don't know what the future holds for me, or what my relationship with my family will look like in the years to come. But I know this: my identity is no longer defined by my past, by the labels others have given me, or by the fears that once held me captive. It is defined by the love of Jesus Christ, the love that never gave up on me, the love that called me out of darkness and into His light. And as I continue on this journey, I hope that my story can serve as a beacon of hope for anyone who feels lost, rejected, or alone. No matter where you are, no matter what you've done, there is a love that is greater than any of your mistakes, a grace that can heal even the deepest wounds. That's the truth I've found, and it is my prayer that you will find it too. If you connect with this journey, consider how your beliefs and challenges can lead you toward a deeper understanding of God's grace and love. If you found this story meaningful, be sure to like, comment, and share it with others who might find hope and inspiration in it. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reflect the power of faith, transformation, and redemption.